But in the bedroom, that's exactly what you want. In privacy, in your relationship, you need to be able to open that slutty side and say, hey, I've chosen you as my man. I have pulled you off the top of that hierarchy. You are who I want, and I'm going to be a complete slut for you.
Our question today comes from Isabella, who recently started a kinky relationship with a man. After being with him a few times, she realized that she's into degradation, but when he specifically calls her words like slut and whore, she gets a mental whiplash and feels uncomfortable. She likes the other kinky stuff that he's into, but wonders if this reaction of hers means that they're not compatible.
They may not be, but they also may be. It's a little interesting to me, of course, that these specific words are the ones that are getting her. We've talked on other episodes about these words, and they have deep cultural connotations that can't really be escaped because we grew up with them. We have them in our consciousness, in our subconsciousness. And so the challenge for them here to figure out their compatibility is to make all that unconscious processing conscious so that they can articulate it, talk about it, and see whether they can get onto the same page or not. And that requires a bit of thought on both of their parts about things that are pretty unconscious. For instance, I think she needs to explore why slut and whore as words are causing her quote-unquote whiplash. What does that whiplash mean? What is that feeling? He needs to explore what those words mean to him. Is he really comfortable giving them up? Is he really going to be fulfilled if he cannot degrade her in specifically those ways? I would not be. I particularly value freedom in language in the bedroom. I dirty talk a lot, and being able to say any crazy dirty thing that comes into my head is a big part of the freedom of erotic expression that's important for me in the bedroom. I've learned that about myself. So when I've been with partners who say, oh, I don't like this form of degradation, I can play with them, but it's very hard for me to have a long-term relationship there. One or two things is fine, but not slut or whore. Those are big ones. Okay, if she's not okay being called fuck pet, then that's a very specific thing. Like, you can work around it. How often does it really come up? But slut and whore have such deep cultural connotations, they can be hard to work around.
One of the ways in which I took this question was she says that she enjoys a lot of the kinky stuff that they're doing together, but when it comes to the words, that's where she starts to have this quote-unquote mental whiplash. The way that I thought of that was when it comes to the actual embodiment of the dynamic, and I'm assuming this is a dominant-submissive dynamic, when there's no actual talking involved and it's mostly just embodied, whether that be he's spanking her or choking her or tying her up or whatever, she's all for it. But when it becomes quote-unquote too real, where the words are said, it's out now in the ether, it's almost like now they're talking about it. Now labels are being used, and these are labels that she has to process. She has a recoil to that action. And I'm wondering if, to some extent, she's not fully integrated or internalized her kink desires. She is happy to indulge in them, but she doesn't want to hear about them. Specifically, she doesn't want to be reminded of the label. She doesn't want to be reminded that she is acting slutty, or she is acting in a way that would be consistent with being called, quote-unquote, a whore. So first of all, I wonder what your take on that interpretation is. And secondly, you've explained this in another video before, but I think it's pretty useful to go over how you go about redefining these terms in your dynamic relationships and the utility of doing that.
Sure. As far as the integration issue, it's possible. I think that's a good read. I think it's a possible read. And again, this is what she has to figure out is, if I dive in there, is that something that I want to integrate? Now, I suspect for the majority of women, you are correct, but not everyone. I think that there are some women, just because humanity is broad and varied and unique in many ways, there are some women who would dive into their unconscious and realize, no, I don't want to integrate that. And that's not what I want to be. That's not who I want to be. Another way of putting what you just said, however, is that in some ways, at least as far as these terms go, they are participating in rough sex, but not BDSM, not kink. And This is often the line between rough sex and what I would consider quote unquote true kink or BDSM, which is the integration of psychology. Sure, he slaps me and chokes me and spanks me and hits me. That's rough sex. But once you start calling me a slut and a whore, once you start playing with my mind and bringing in my unconscious self and my full emotional self, which is often triggered by language because that's the deepest connection we can have between human beings, then things start to spiral away because it's not just sensory. Hey all, this is Athos. If you're enjoying this content and you'd like to see more, please be sure to spank that subscribe button. It's been very naughty. And if you'd like to have your question answered on the show, please feel free to ask us by email at deeperkink@gmail.com or click the link in the description below to complete the form. Now, back to the show. I often reference my definition of kink, which requires, as I say, a perceptual overlay. And what I mean by that is when you sip espresso, on the surface of it, it's bitter. Kids don't like espresso. Adults often are able to enjoy espresso because they layer perception over that sensation and it provides a deep pleasure. Same for something like whiskey, where, yeah, a kid is not going to enjoy a 40-year-old whiskey because it requires the ability to see through the alcohol to the complexity. And it's not just sugar. It's not sweet and simple. It is complex and deep and dark and has all these different things. And so that willingness to overlay perception on top of sensation is a big part of what I would consider quote unquote true BDSM or true kink. And a lot of it is linguistic that pulls on these kinds of cultural terms. And so I think that may be what she's running into integrating, is integrating perception and psychology rather than just sensation. And I think a lot of people do these physical things like spanking or using a toy or something like that, and then they call it kink. And really, those are the props of kink. Those are the smoke and mirrors of kink. It's not the core. The core is always the psychology and the embodied meaning of these actions. And so that's a segue into your second question, the meaning of the term slut, the meaning of the term whore. And in the book, I explain each of those has an archetypal reference. So whore is the shadow form, the submissive shadow form of the maiden archetype. So the maiden you can see in Beauty and the Beast or Snow White or Little Mermaid. Any of these are common cultural references. Any romance novel basically is the maiden archetype. Young girl looking for a bigger world, finding a man, so on and so forth. All the whole story. Beauty and the Beast is probably the most classic version of that. And the notion of the whore is the concern with purity, the concern with dirtiness, and of course the engagement with sexuality in a non-erotic context is dirty. Just imagine your partner spitting into a cup of water. Well, wait a minute. Now you just kissed them. And erotically, it's fine to swap saliva. But non-erotically, now, if you're doing it as a degradation thing, now you're making that erotic. But in a non-erotic context, that is startling, and because it is that you're triggering notions of purity. And that is the emotional basis of the whore concept. And the way that that is expressed specifically is the notion of the transactional, is to take something, and again, we're talking archetypally. So in the romance novel, sex is this sort of like pure and loving thing, and you're making it transactional. You're taking the sacred and you are making it profane. That is what the whore is doing. It's a transition there between the sacred and the profane. And engaging with that is necessary for deeply erotic sex. Because if you try to keep sex as a sacred thing, you end up with only, not banal, but you can only engage in one type of sex. You can only have like loving, respectful. This is the Madonna-Whore Complex. This is where people run into exactly this is, oh, I can't have dirty sex with my wife because she's this saint that I've put up on a pedestal. She's too pure for that, is the commentary. So the transactional, the impure, the profane, that is the realm of the whore archetype. And the emotions there are at least somewhat necessary for really erotic sex. Now, in my personal relationships, part of how I redefine whore for my partner is I differentiate the notion of whore from prostitute. A prostitute is a woman where the transaction is for money, where she is doing a sexual job for money, whereas in our relationship, her being a whore means that arousing and satisfying me sexually is her job. It's her duty. It's her obligation. And that is playing into similar archetypes. It is taking the sacred and making it somewhat profane that, hey, draining my balls every day is your job, and you need to work it like a job, and you need to be good at it, and you need to practice it. And all of those things train into this notion of whore, but differentiated from prostitute, because the prostitute's doing it for money. She's doing it as a part of her relational role. So that's part of the redefinition of whore. Slut has equally deep connotations. Slut is the notion of making sex easy to access, and again, upsets the sexual apple cart, because our whole biologic species sexual plan is that the men are going to compete with themselves and with the environment, and women are going to select off the top. And that only works if they do not provide sexual access very easily, only making it accessible to the men who win the competitions. If a woman starts providing easy sexual access to lower status men, then the whole system gets upset, because then other women can't compete with her. So it upsets the entire sexual selection process biologically. And that's why we have such cultural shaming around anything that indicates that a woman is making sex easy to access. And that includes everything from how she dresses to how she acts to even enjoying sex. Women admitting that they enjoy sex is somewhat quote-unquote slutty, and being public about that. All of those things are frowned upon because it is signaling that that woman is upsetting the entire biologic plan for the species on some level. But in the bedroom, that's exactly what you want. In privacy, in your relationship, you need to be able to open that slutty side and say, hey, I've chosen you as my man. I have pulled you off the top of that hierarchy. You are who I want, and I'm going to be a complete slut for you. And that is actually the mark of your success in some sense. And I think men feel this, is if their partner is not being slutty for them, something went wrong. They didn't win correctly.
Right.
And so, just to finish this out, to redefine slut in my relationship, I define a slut as a woman who prioritizes her sexuality over her dignity, or over propriety, right? And I definitely expect in my relationship that if a choice comes between you being proper or you being dignified and you engaging sexually, you will choose sexuality each time in our relationship.
In your relationship, yeah.
So with those definitions, then you can throw those out and say, hey, are you able to accept that this is what I mean in our relationship? Or are those the standard cultural negative views of those words so strong in you that you can't quite overcome them, in which case we would be incompatible?
Yeah, it wouldn't even necessarily be about whether or not you understand what the words mean. I think she does understand what they mean, but in her mind, she doesn't want to be a quote-unquote slut or a whore specifically for this man. That's not how she sees herself in relation to the man. So if she's engaging in BDSM or kinky play, the door's already kind of been swung open to the possibility of that being their relationship. But it has to be very explicit. He has to sit her down and he has to say, listen, if you are recoiling against these words, let us put these words on the table and talk about what they mean. And we will both understand that outside of our relationship and outside of our dynamic, I view you as a respectable human being, as a person who's worthy of honor and respect. But in the context of our relationship, I want you to be slutty and whorish for me. So it's not that you're doing it for the whole world. It's not that this is a global judgment on you as a person. This is your sacrifice, to use a word for it, to me. You are sacrificing your dignity for my pleasure, and that is when I call you a whore, that is the thread that we're pulling on. do you
Slut.
accept the terms
Yes.
or not? Yeah, slut or whore,
Right.
do you accept these terms or not? And then she would have to explicitly make a decision about how she felt about this individual.
Yeah.
And if she did decide to make a decision, she'd be able to take her archetypical,
Sure.
sluttish, whorish, that part of her that craves and loves sex, and be able to deploy that in the safe container of a well
Yeah.
negotiated kink dynamic.
And I have also framed this with ex-partners that like part of my view of my job in a relationship is to provide enough safety that she can let out her inner slut. And again, I think that handled carefully and here are tips, right, from years of playing these games, many women struggle with a slut and are okay with my slut or daddy's little slut or even just a slight softening of my sweet slut, right? Sweet little slut, good little whore. Those are easier to frame because of the softening, the possessiveness, the integration into the relationship. Those can often provide ways of freeing up some space by subconsciously and implicitly reminding, even in the moment, that this is for our relationship. This is, you're not a slut broadly, you are my slut. You are a slut for me personally. Right.
I think defining this, sitting down in the beginning of a potential kink relationship, or even in the middle where you want to bring this element to the forefront, sitting down and having this explicit conversation about these definitions and what the underlying psychology behind it is, I think that's a very useful trick. I mean, trick may be the wrong word, but it's a very useful maneuver because when you use the word, that word is laden with so much underlying psychology about the dynamic between the two of you. It's a good label to reanimate the dynamic by just using that word. Every time that word is used, because you have explicitly set up definitions or you have explicitly defined the philosophy behind that philosophy becomes reanimated every time that word is being used. She's reminded of what it means because you've explained it so well to begin with.
And actually pretty powerfully. So one of the interesting things here is that if they get to a point where they redefine and he clarifies maybe even all these things just the way that I've said them, she accepts those definitions from him deeply, maybe she's okay with the possessive form, my slut or my whore. What's interesting is that because it is unique to him, it will be innately deeply more powerful. And so what's interesting here is the potential for deeper, it's a very all or nothing thing. Either they're going to be incredibly deeply compatible here, or they're not compatible at all. And that is, to some degree, their ability to converge on definitions and find acceptable ways of expressing. If they do, if she's willing to accept his reframing, then every time he says the word slut, the entire persona context will be there, and it will then be overwhelmed by the intimate, erotic context and will be a very rich and erotic source of emotion and degradation and submission. Whereas a woman who is more neutral on those terms would not have as strong a reaction. Again, it's baked so deep into the culture, it's very rare to find a woman who has no reaction, but it would be much less. And so it's an interesting catch-22 here, is that if they're able to get on the same page and actually flesh out these definitions, they could have a great time. But yeah, it does require a bit of explicit discussion and seeing if they can get on the same page in a clear discussion.